pharmacy's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh as Caroline Mitchell stepped inside, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the unopened canister of premium baby formula. The fluoride lights overhead seemed too bright, making her squint as she made her way toward the customer service counter. She'd rehearsed what she would say a dozen times during the walk here, but now that she stood in line behind two other customers, the words felt stuck in her throat like cotton. It had been 3 days since she'd bought the formula. 3 days of staring at it on her kitchen counter, knowing she couldn't afford to keep it. The price tag had made her wince when she'd grabbed it in desperation. $68 for a single container. At the time, with little Melissa crying in her arms and her own milk supply failing, she hadn't thought twice. But then the electric bill had arrived, past due and threatening disconnection. The choice between feeding her 6-month-old daughter and keeping the lights on shouldn't have been a choice at all. Yet here she was. Caroline shifted her weight from one worn sneaker to the other, acutely aware of how she must look. Her jeans had a small tear at the knee, not the fashionable kind, but the kind that came from too many washes and not enough money for replacements. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd worn makeup. 28 years old, and she felt ancient. The woman in front of her finished her transaction and moved away. Caroline approached the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I need to return this," she said quietly, sliding the formula across the counter to the teenage clerk whose name tag read Brandon. Brandon picked up the container, examining it. "Do you have your receipt?" Caroline's stomach dropped. I think I lost it. But I bought it here 3 days ago. It's unopened, I swear, She stopped herself before she could explain further. The shame was already burning her cheeks. She didn't need to advertise her poverty to everyone in earshot. Brandon's expression was sympathetic, but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Store policy requires a receipt for returns. Without it, there's nothing I can do." Caroline felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Please, I really need to return this. I can't—" Her voice cracked. "I made a mistake buying it." "Let me call the manager," Brandon said, reaching for the phone. While she waited, Caroline became aware of the people in line behind her, their impatience palpable in their sighs and shifting feet. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, and never face another human being again. This was what her life had become, begging teenagers to bend the rules so she could return baby formula she desperately needed, but couldn't afford to keep. A man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped up beside her, not behind her in line, but beside her. As if he had every right to skip ahead, Caroline glanced at him, ready to feel annoyed, but the words died on her lips. She knew that face, every sharp angle, every line. Those piercing blue eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness. The dark hair, now slightly silver at the temples, perfectly styled. Even after 5 years, even though she'd tried so hard to forget, she knew him instantly. Marcus Ashford, her ex-husband, and one of the wealthiest men in the city. Their eyes met, and Caroline watched as recognition dawned on his face. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to absolute shock, his mouth opening slightly. She looked away quickly, her whole body going rigid. Of all the pharmacies in Manhattan, of all the moments in time, why did it have to be now? Why did he have to see her like this? "Caroline?" His voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep, measured, tinged with that slight Boston accent he'd never quite lost despite years in New York. She didn't respond, couldn't respond. Her throat had closed completely. Marcus looked down at the formula container on the counter, then back at her face. His eyes traveled downward, and she knew what he was looking for. Evidence of a pregnancy she'd never had when they were together. Evidence of a child. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked Brandon, his tone shifting into something Caroline recognized as his business voice, the one that made people scramble to accommodate him. "No problem, sir, just waiting for the manager about a return," Brandon said, suddenly more alert. "There won't be a need for that," Marcus said smoothly. He pulled out his wallet, extracting a black credit card that probably had no limit. "I'll purchase the formula. The lady can keep her money." "No," Caroline said sharply, finding her voice at last. "No, I don't need your charity, Marcus." He turned to her fully now, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hurt. Anger. She couldn't tell. "It's not charity, I said no." Caroline snatched the formula container off the counter, clutching it to her chest. "I don't need anything from you, I never did." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She'd needed so much from him toward the end of their marriage. His time, his attention, his emotional support, and he'd given her none of it, too consumed by building his empire to notice his wife slowly drowning in loneliness. "Caroline, please." Marcus reached out as if to touch her arm but stopped short. "Let me help. If you have a baby, if you need—" "You don't know anything about my life," Caroline interrupted, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. People were definitely staring now. "You gave up that right 5 years ago when you chose your company over our marriage." Marcus's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Caroline laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about fair? You don't get to swoop in here and play hero, Marcus. You don't get to throw your money at problems and make everything better. That's not how life works." The manager appeared then, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an efficient demeanor. "I understand there's an issue with a return." Caroline looked at the formula in her hands, then at Marcus, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. The shame that had brought her to her knees moments ago was now transformed into something else, a fierce, burning pride that she didn't even know she still possessed. "Never mind," she said to the manager. "I'm keeping it." She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as she could muster, the $68 formula container clutched in her hands like a trophy. She had no idea how she was going to pay her electric bill now. She had no idea how she was going to afford groceries for the rest of the month, but she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't take money from Marcus Ashford. Not now, not ever. Behind her, she heard Marcus call her name, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the automatic doors and out into the crisp October afternoon, her vision blurred with unshed tears. What Caroline didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Marcus stood frozen in that pharmacy for a full minute after she left, his mind racing through calculations and memories, the baby formula, the desperation in her eyes, the timeline. Because Marcus Ashford had excellent recall for dates and numbers, it was part of what made him successful in business. And he remembered, with sudden crystal clarity, the last night he and Caroline had spent together before their divorce was finalized, 5 years ago. Almost to the day. Word count, 1,187. I need to add more words to reach the 1,500, 1,600 range. Let me continue. Marcus's hand was still outstretched, frozen in the gesture of reaching for someone who was no longer there. The other customers had returned to their business, the drama over, but Brandon and the manager were both watching him with curious expressions. "Sir, did you need something?" the manager asked gently. Marcus blinked, returning to himself. No, thank you." He walked away from the counter in a daze, his mind still working through the implications of what he'd just witnessed. Caroline had always been proud, even when they were married. She came from a working-class family and had put herself through college while waitressing nights. That independence, that refusal to rely on anyone, had been one of the things he'd initially found attractive about her, but it had also been a source of tension between them. She'd never wanted his money, never wanted the lifestyle his wealth could provide. She'd married him despite his fortune, not because of it. And now, 5 years later, she was returning baby formula because she couldn't afford it. The woman who had once shared his penthouse, who had access to accounts with more money than most people earned in a lifetime, was counting pennies at a pharmacy counter. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. During their marriage, he'd been so focused on growing Ashford Industries, on proving to his late father's business partners that he could handle the company, that he'd neglected the one person who had mattered most. Caroline had asked for his time, for his presence, for him to be a husband instead of a workaholic CEO. He'd promised to do better, to be better, but the promises had always been empty. There was always one more deal, one more meeting, one more crisis that needed his attention. She'd left him finally after 3 years of marriage. He'd been in Tokyo closing a merger when she'd moved out. He'd come home to an empty apartment and divorce papers on the kitchen counter. No note, no explanation beyond what they'd both already known. He'd chosen his company over her, again and again until there was nothing left of them to save. Marcus walked out of the pharmacy, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of Caroline's retreating figure. She was gone, swallowed up by the Manhattan crowds. But he couldn't shake the image of her face thinner than he remembered. Exhaustion etched into every feature, and that formula container, that damn formula container. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his assistant with some urgent matter. But for once in his life, Marcus Ashford ignored a business call because somewhere in this city was his ex-wife, possibly with his child, struggling to survive. And he intended to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Marcus returned to his office at Ashford Industries, but his mind was anywhere except on the quarterly reports waiting on his mahogany desk. His assistant Patricia, a sharp woman in her 50s who had been with him for over a decade, noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Mr. Ashford?" "The conference call with the Tokyo investors starts in 10 minutes, she reminded him, poking her head through his office door. "Cancel it," Marcus said without looking up from where he stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Patricia's eyes widened. Marcus Ashford never cancelled calls with investors. "Sir, they've been waiting 3 weeks for this." "Reschedule it, Patricia. Tell them something came up, a family emergency." The words felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't had a family in 5 years, not since Caroline left. After Patricia retreated, clearly bewildered, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Raymond Chen speaking." "Raymond, it's Marcus Ashford. I need your services." Raymond was a private investigator Marcus had used occasionally for business matters, background checks on potential partners, verification of credentials, discreet, efficient, and expensive. "Mr. Ashford, it's been a while. What can I do for you?" "I need you to find someone, Caroline Mitchell. She was Caroline Ashford 5 years ago. I need her current address, employment status, financial situation, everything you can get me within 24 hours. There was a pause. "Personal matter. Does it matter?" "Only for my rate," Raymond said dryly. "Personal investigations cost more. Privacy concerns and all that. Bill me whatever you need. Just get me the information." After he hung up, Marcus sat down at his desk, but his hands were shaking slightly. The baby formula kept replaying in his mind. 6 months old, perhaps, based on the stage listed on the container, which meant conception would have been approximately 15 months ago. He and Caroline had been divorced for 5 years. The math didn't add up to him being the father. But then why did the sight of her in that pharmacy, desperate and ashamed, feel like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart? The truth was simpler and more painful than biological connection. He still cared about her, perhaps had never stopped caring about her. He'd buried himself in work after the divorce, telling himself it was better this way, that they'd been incompatible, that she was better off without him. But seeing her today had shattered that comfortable fiction. She wasn't better off, and if she'd moved on, found someone else, had a child with them, he should be happy for her. Instead, he felt hollow. Meanwhile, across the city in a small studio apartment in Queens, Caroline sat on the edge of her second-hand couch, staring at the formula container on her coffee table. Melissa was napping in the corner where Caroline had set up a makeshift nursery. Just a crib, a changing table, and a small dresser, all bought from thrift stores or found on the street. The encounter with Marcus had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. For 5 years, she'd successfully avoided him. Manhattan was a big city, and they'd moved in completely different circles. He had his penthouse, his galas, his business meetings in high-rise boardrooms. She had her tiny apartment, her 2 part-time jobs as a waitress and a grocery store cashier, and her daughter. Her beautiful, perfect, unexpected daughter. Caroline's hand drifted to her phone. She should call her sister Monica, who lived in Boston. Monica would know what to say, how to make this feel less catastrophic. But Monica also had 3 kids of her own and a husband who'd just lost his job. Caroline couldn't burden her with this. A soft cry came from the nursery corner. Caroline stood immediately, crossing to the crib where Melissa was waking up, her tiny fists rubbing at her eyes. Caroline lifted her daughter, breathing in that sweet baby smell, feeling her racing heart begin to slow. "It's okay, sweet pea," she murmured. "Mama's got you." Melissa had her father's eyes. That was the cruel irony of it all. Not Marcus's eyes. Caroline had never cheated on him, never even thought about it during their marriage. No, Melissa had the eyes of Daniel Cooper, the fellow waitress she'd dated briefly 2 years after her divorce. Daniel had been kind, funny, and entirely wrong for her. They'd dated for 3 months before he'd gotten a job offer in Seattle and decided to take it. Caroline had been fine with that, until 2 weeks later when she'd discovered she was pregnant. She'd tried to contact Daniel, had sent him messages, emails, even tried calling, but his number had changed, and his social media accounts had gone silent. Eventually, she'd stopped trying. She would raise Melissa alone, just as her own mother had raised her and Monica after their father had left. But it was so much harder than she'd imagined. The jobs barely covered rent and basic expenses. She'd applied for assistance programs, and they helped, but it was never quite enough. Every month was a juggling act of which bills to pay, which to delay, what groceries were absolute necessities versus luxuries. And her milk supply had been drying up for weeks now, stress and poor nutrition taking their toll. The formula was essential, which meant the electric bill would have to wait another month. She'd deal with the consequences when they came. A knock at her door startled her. Caroline wasn't expecting anyone. Holding Melissa against her shoulder, she approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. A delivery man stood in the hallway, holding a large box and a clipboard. Caroline opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" "Delivery for Caroline Mitchell. Need your signature." "I didn't order anything." The delivery man checked his clipboard. "Says here it's a gift, already paid for. I just need you to sign that you received it." Suspicious but curious, Caroline unlatched the chain and signed the electronic pad he offered. The moment she did, he handed her the box and left, before she could ask any questions. The box was large and surprisingly heavy. Caroline set it on her couch and examined it. No return address, just her name and address on the label. Using one hand while supporting Melissa with the other, she managed to tear open the tape. Inside were 6 containers of baby formula, the exact brand and type she'd tried to return, along with diapers, baby wipes, jars of organic baby food, and a white envelope. Caroline's hands were shaking as she opened the envelope. Inside was a note written in handwriting she recognized immediately. Bold, efficient, masculine. Marcus's handwriting. "Caroline, I know you don't want my help, but please accept this for the baby's sake. No strings attached. You don't have to contact me or acknowledge this in any way. I just need to know the child is cared for. There's also a check. Please use it. M." She looked in the envelope again and found a check, made out to her, for $50,000. Caroline sank onto the couch, Melissa still in her arms, staring at the check. $50,000. It was more money than she'd seen in 5 years combined. It would pay off her debts, cover rent for months, allow her to maybe cut back to one job so she could spend more time with Melissa. It was also everything she'd sworn she would never do, except Marcus Ashford's money. But as Melissa made a small cooing sound and curled her tiny hand around Caroline's finger, she felt her resolve wavering. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about her daughter's well-being. And yet, how had Marcus found her address so quickly? Had he been keeping tabs on her all these years? The thought sent a chill down her spine. What Caroline didn't know was that at that very moment, Marcus was sitting in his office, staring at a dossier Raymond Chen had just delivered. A dossier containing information about Caroline's life over the past 5 years, including details about her employment, her finances, and most importantly, information about Melissa's father, Daniel Cooper, Seattle resident, completely uninvolved in his daughter's life. Marcus should have felt relieved. The child wasn't his, he had no obligation here. But instead, he felt something else entirely, a fierce, protective anger at a man who would abandon his own child, and a growing determination that if Caroline wouldn't let him help her directly, he would find another way. Because Marcus Ashford was nothing if not persistent, and he'd already made one catastrophic mistake with Caroline 5 years ago. He wasn't going to make another. Caroline didn't cash the check. For 3 days it sat on her kitchen counter, a constant reminder of everything complicated between her and Marcus. She'd put the formula and supplies to use immediately. Melissa needed them, and Caroline's pride couldn't extend to letting her daughter suffer. But the check felt different. The check felt like accepting something she could never repay, like opening a door she'd worked so hard to keep closed. On the 4th day, she returned home from her morning shift at the diner to find Marcus Ashford sitting on the steps outside her apartment building. He stood when he saw her approaching, and Caroline's first instinct was to turn around and walk away. But she was exhausted, her feet ached, and she'd left Melissa with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who charged $5 an hour that Caroline could barely afford. She didn't have time for this. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not bothering to hide her irritation. "You didn't cash the check." "How would you know that?" "I have alerts set up on my accounts." Marcus looked uncomfortable standing there in his $1,000 suit outside her rundown building in Queens. Good. He should feel uncomfortable. "I don't want your money, Marcus. I told you that." "Then why did you keep the formula and supplies?" Caroline felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's different." "That was for Melissa." "Melissa." Marcus repeated the name softly, something unreadable crossing his face. "That's a beautiful name. I need to get upstairs." Caroline moved to pass him, but he stepped into her path. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. I need to talk to you." "We have nothing to talk about." "I think we do." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know about Daniel Cooper." Caroline froze, her blood running cold. "You investigated me. I needed to understand. You had no right." Her voice rose, attracting the attention of a few people passing on the street. She lowered it, but the anger remained. "You had no right to dig into my life, Marcus. We're divorced. What I do, who I see, who I have a child with, none of that is your business anymore." "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." "But Caroline, when I saw you in that pharmacy, trying to return formula because you couldn't afford it," he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their marriage, one he only made when he was truly distressed. "It broke something in me, knowing you were struggling, that you have a child, that the father isn't helping. I don't need his help. I don't need anyone's help. I'm managing just fine. Are you?" Marcus gestured to the building behind her, with its cracked facade and broken intercom. "Are you really managing fine? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're drowning." The words hit too close to home. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Get out of my way, Marcus. Come work for me." The statement was so unexpected that Caroline actually laughed. "Excuse me?" "Come work at Ashford Industries. I need a new executive assistant. Patricia is retiring next month. The salary is $150,000 a year, full benefits, flexible hours for childcare. You'd be perfect for it." Caroline stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. Marcus, I'm a waitress. I don't have any experience. You have a degree in business administration. You were top of your class at NYU. You worked as a marketing coordinator before we got married. That was 8 years ago. And I quit that job when we got married because you said—" She stopped herself, the old argument rising up like bile in her throat. He'd said she didn't need to work, that his income was more than enough for both of them. She'd protested, not wanting to be dependent, but he'd been so persuasive. And eventually she'd given in, letting herself be swept up in the fantasy of being married to Marcus Ashford. It had been the beginning of the end. Without her own career, her own identity outside of being Mrs. Ashford, she'd felt increasingly lost and isolated, while Marcus worked 100-hour weeks. "I know what I said back then was wrong," Marcus said now. "I was wrong about a lot of things. But this isn't charity, Caroline. I genuinely need someone, and you're qualified. More than qualified. And the fact that I'm your ex-wife wouldn't make things incredibly awkward. It would be professional, strictly professional. You'd have your own office, your own projects. You wouldn't even have to see me most days if you didn't want to." Caroline wanted to say no. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to refuse, to maintain the distance she'd worked so hard to establish. But $150,000 a year, benefits, flexible hours, she could move to a better apartment, she could afford childcare. She could stop working doubles at the diner, stop coming home with her feet bleeding in her shoes. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." Marcus pulled out a business card and held it out to her. "My personal number is on the back. Call me when you decide." Caroline took the card, careful not to let their fingers touch. "I should go. Mrs. Kowalski charges by the hour." "Wait." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He extracted several bills. Caroline saw they were hundreds and held them out to her. "For the babysitter." "Marcus, please, just for today, let me do this one small thing." Against her better judgment, Caroline took the money. She told herself it was for Melissa, not for her, that accepting help for her daughter wasn't the same as accepting help for herself. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Marcus's business card in one hand and his money in the other, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Mrs. Kowalski, a kind Polish woman in her 70s, was rocking Melissa when Caroline entered. "There's my favorite baby," Caroline cooed, taking her daughter and thanking Mrs. Kowalski profusely while pressing $20 into her hand, more than the $15 she owed. But after the money Marcus had given her, she could afford to be generous for once. After Mrs. Kowalski left, Caroline sat on her couch with Melissa in her lap, looking around her tiny studio. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors arguing above her. The radiator clanked and hissed, but never provided quite enough heat. There was a persistent leak under the sink that her landlord refused to fix. This wasn't the life she wanted for her daughter, but working for Marcus, seeing him every day, existing in his world again, the world she'd escaped from. Her phone rang. An unknown number. Caroline almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Miss Mitchell, this is Dr. Patel from Queen's General Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Melissa Mitchell. She's been flagged in our system for missing her 6-month checkup and vaccinations." Caroline's stomach dropped. She'd been meaning to schedule the appointment, but between work and everything else, she'd lost track of time. "I'm so sorry. I'll schedule something right away. I strongly encourage you to do so. Vaccinations are crucial at this stage. We have an opening tomorrow at 2, but I see from your file that you don't have health insurance?" "No, I'm working on that. The visit will be approximately $300, and the vaccinations are another $200. We can work out a payment plan if—" "I'll be there tomorrow at 2, Caroline interrupted. "Thank you, doctor." After she hung up, Caroline looked down at Melissa, who was happily gumming her fist. $500 for a doctor's visit. She had maybe $200 in her account, and that was supposed to last until her next paycheck. She looked at Marcus's business card on the coffee table, then at the uncashed check, then back at her daughter. The decision, it seemed, had been made for her. Caroline picked up her phone and dialed the number on the back of the card. Marcus answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for her call. "Marcus? It's Caroline." "About that job offer." She took a deep breath, hating herself a little bit even as she said the words. "I accept. When do I start?" There was a pause on the other end, and when Marcus spoke, she could hear the smile in his voice. "Monday. I'll have HR send over the paperwork tonight. Caroline, thank you. You won't regret this." But as she hung up the phone, Caroline wondered if she already did, because accepting this job meant inviting Marcus Ashford back into her life. And the last time she'd done that, it had nearly destroyed her. What she didn't know, what Marcus hadn't told her, was that Patricia wasn't actually retiring. Marcus had convinced her to take an extended, fully paid vacation instead, with a substantial bonus for her discretion. The job he'd offered Caroline was real, but it had been created specifically for her. He'd manipulated the entire situation to get her to accept his help. And as Marcus sat in his penthouse that evening, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, he told himself he'd done it for the right reasons, to help someone who needed it, to make amends for past mistakes. But there was another truth he wasn't quite ready to admit, even to himself. He wanted Caroline back in his life, and he would do whatever it took to keep her there. Caroline's first day at Ashford Industries was nothing like she'd expected. She'd imagined feeling out of place, overwhelmed, perhaps patronized by employees who would see her as the boss's ex-wife charity case. Instead, she was treated with professional courtesy by everyone she met. Her office was spacious and elegant, with a view of the city that took her breath away. The work itself, managing Marcus's schedule, coordinating between departments, handling correspondence, came back to her more easily than she'd anticipated. What surprised her most was Marcus himself. He was different than she remembered, more present, more attentive. During their marriage, he'd been perpetually distracted, his mind always half-focused on the next deal, the next crisis. But now, when they had their daily briefings, he listened completely. He asked about her opinions on company matters and actually implemented her suggestions. He never once mentioned their past or crossed any professional boundaries. By the end of her first month, Caroline had to admit she was enjoying the work. More than that, she was good at it. The confidence she'd lost during her years of struggling was slowly returning. She'd moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, had hired a wonderful nanny named Jennifer, who came highly recommended, and had even bought herself new clothes that made her feel like a professional again, rather than someone constantly on the verge of collapse. But there was something else happening too, something she tried desperately to ignore. She was remembering why she'd fallen in love with Marcus Ashford in the first place. It happened in small moments. The way he brought her coffee without being asked, remembering exactly how she liked it after all these years. The time he'd noticed she was stressed about finding childcare when Jennifer was sick, and had immediately arranged for the company's backup childcare service, which she hadn't even known existed. The afternoon he'd found her crying in her office after a particularly difficult phone call with her landlord about a rent increase, and had simply sat with her in silence until she'd composed herself, not offering empty platitudes or trying to fix everything with money, just being there. It was dangerous, this growing warmth between them. Caroline knew it, but she couldn't seem to stop it. 3 months into her new job, everything changed. Caroline was working late, finishing a presentation for Marcus's board meeting the next morning. Most of the office had emptied out hours ago. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear Marcus enter her office until he spoke. "You're still here?" Caroline looked up, startled. Marcus stood in her doorway, his tie loosened, looking as tired as she felt. "Just finishing the quarterly report. I'll have it ready for tomorrow." "Caroline, it's after 9. Go home to Melissa. Jennifer's with her. It's fine, I just need another hour." Marcus walked into her office and gently closed her laptop. "It can wait until morning. You've been working yourself to exhaustion," says the man who practically lives in his office. "That's different." "How?" "Because I don't have a 6-month-old daughter at home." Marcus paused, seeming to realize what he'd said. "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. I just meant you should have balance, the kind of balance I never gave you when we were married." There it was. The first direct reference to their past in 3 months. Caroline looked up at him, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," he said, sitting down in the chair across from her desk. "Something I should have told you 3 months ago, but I was afraid you'd refuse the job if you knew." Caroline's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Patricia wasn't retiring. I asked her to take an extended vacation so I could create this position for you. I manipulated the situation because I needed you to accept my help, and I knew you wouldn't if it seemed like charity." The betrayal hit her like cold water. Caroline stood up abruptly. "You lied to me." "I did, and I'm sorry." "But Caroline, I'm not sorry I did it because these past 3 months..." He stood too, running his hand through his hair in that familiar gesture. "You belong here. You've revolutionized how this office runs. The board has noticed. Everyone has noticed. You're brilliant at this job, and it has nothing to do with our past or my feelings or..." He stopped himself. "Your feelings?" Caroline repeated quietly. Marcus looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he wasn't saying. "I never stopped loving you, Caroline. Not for a single day in 5 years. Seeing you in that pharmacy, it was like waking up from a 5-year coma and realizing what an idiot I'd been. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I destroyed what we had. But I had to tell you the truth, even if it means you walk out that door right now and I never see you again." Caroline felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You broke my heart, Marcus. You made me feel invisible, like I didn't matter as much as your company, your deals, your success. I know, and I've spent every day of the past 3 months trying to prove to you that I've changed, that I'm not that man anymore." "People don't change, Marcus, not really." "You're wrong." He took a step closer, but not close enough to touch her. "I've been seeing a therapist twice a week for the past year, working through why I couldn't let myself be vulnerable, why I hid behind work instead of facing my marriage. My father died when I was 23 and left me a company I wasn't ready to run, and I spent the next decade trying to prove I was worthy of his legacy. But in doing that, I lost the only thing that actually mattered. I lost you." Caroline wanted to stay angry, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of being hurt again. But she couldn't deny what she'd seen over the past 3 months. Marcus had changed. He left the office at reasonable hours now. He delegated more. He was present in a way he'd never been before. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said honestly. "Then let me earn it back, however long it takes. I'm not asking you to dive back into a relationship with me. I'm just asking for the chance to prove that I can be the man you deserved the first time around." Before Caroline could respond, her phone rang. Jennifer's name flashed on the screen. Caroline answered immediately, her heart racing. "Caroline, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Melissa has a fever of 103. I've given her infant Tylenol, but it's not coming down. I think you should come home, maybe take her to the emergency room. I'm on my way." Caroline grabbed her purse and coat, her hands shaking. "I'm leaving right now." Marcus was already moving. "I'll drive you. It's faster than a cab." Caroline wanted to argue, but practicality won out. They rushed to the parking garage where Marcus's car, a sleek black Mercedes, was waiting. The drive to Queens took 20 minutes, Marcus weaving through traffic with focused precision, while Caroline tried not to panic. She called Jennifer twice for updates, her worry growing with each passing minute. When they arrived at her apartment, Jennifer met them at the door, holding a crying, feverish Melissa. Caroline took her daughter immediately, feeling the heat radiating from her small body. "Let's go to the hospital," Marcus said firmly. At the emergency room, Caroline filled out paperwork with trembling hands, while Marcus held Melissa, gently rocking her and speaking softly. Watching him with her daughter, Caroline felt something crack open in her chest. He was so careful, so tender, even though Melissa wasn't his child. After what felt like hours but was only 45 minutes, a doctor examined Melissa and determined she had a viral infection that would pass in a few days. Nothing serious, but scary for a first-time mother experiencing her baby's first real fever. The relief Caroline felt was so intense she nearly collapsed. Marcus drove them home, helped Caroline get Melissa settled, and then did something that surprised her. He stayed. Not in a romantic way, but simply as support. He made tea, sat with Caroline through the night as they took turns monitoring Melissa's fever, and never once made her feel like she was an imposition. As dawn broke through the apartment windows and Melissa slept peacefully, her fever finally broken, Caroline looked at Marcus dozing in the chair beside her, his expensive suit rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. "Marcus," she said softly. He opened his eyes immediately, alert. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. Fever's down to 99. Caroline paused, gathering her courage. "Thank you for being here, for everything, always," he said simply. "I think," Caroline took a deep breath, "I think I'd like to try again, slowly. Very slowly. No promises, no expectations, just seeing where this goes." The smile that spread across Marcus's face was like sunrise. "Slowly is perfect. We have all the time in the world." Over the following months, they rebuilt their relationship from the ground up. Marcus met Caroline for coffee dates that didn't involve business. He babysat Melissa, so Caroline could have a rare night out with her sister. He attended parenting classes with Caroline, not because Melissa was his daughter, but because he wanted to be part of their lives in whatever way Caroline would allow. And gradually, Caroline let her walls come down. She let herself remember not just the pain of their failed marriage, but also the joy of their early days together. She let herself believe that people could change, that second chances were possible. A year after their reunion in the pharmacy, Marcus surprised Caroline with a weekend trip to the Hamptons. No business, no interruptions, just the three of them, Marcus, Caroline, and Melissa, who was now walking and babbling and completely enamored with the man she called Mark. On their last evening there, as they watched the sunset from the beach with Melissa playing in the sand between them, Marcus turned to Caroline. "I have something to ask you, and I need you to know there's no pressure. Whatever you say, it doesn't change how I feel or our relationship." Caroline's heart began to race. Marcus pulled out a small velvet box, but he didn't open it yet. "5 years ago, I failed you as a husband. I took you for granted, prioritized all the wrong things and lost the most precious thing in my life. I don't want to replace what we had. I couldn't even if I tried, but I want to build something new with you. Something better, stronger, based on who we are now, not who we were." He opened the box, revealing a ring that was nothing like her old engagement ring. That one had been flashy, expensive, designed to impress. This one was simple, elegant, with a single perfect stone that caught the fading sunlight. "Caroline Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your trust, your love, and the honor of being Melissa's father?" Melissa chose that moment to toddle over, grabbing Marcus's knee to steady herself. "Mark," she declared happily, her face covered in sand. Caroline laughed through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marcus slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her. Soft and sweet and full of promise, Melissa squealed with delight and clapped her sandy hands, making them both laugh. That night, after Melissa was asleep in the beach house, Marcus and Caroline sat on the deck watching the stars. "I can't believe I almost walked past you in that pharmacy," Marcus said quietly. "If I'd been 30 seconds earlier or later." "But you weren't," Caroline interrupted. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. Maybe that's what second chances are. The universe giving us another shot at getting it right. Then I intend to get it very, very right this time." They married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just close family and friends. Patricia, who had indeed retired for real this time, attended and told Caroline she'd never seen Marcus so happy. Daniel Cooper, located finally through a lawyer, signed over his parental rights without contest, and Marcus formally adopted Melissa. She would grow up knowing the truth about her biological father, but Marcus was her dad in every way that mattered. 3 years later, standing in the nursery of their new home, not the sterile penthouse, but a warm brownstone in Brooklyn, Caroline watched Marcus rock their newborn son, Christopher, while Melissa read him a story she'd written herself at preschool. "Once upon a time," Melissa began in her serious 4-year-old voice, "there was a princess who lost her crown. She was very sad and had to work very hard. But then, the prince found her again and said sorry for being silly, and they lived happily ever after. The end." Marcus caught Caroline's eye over Melissa's head and smiled. It wasn't the fairy tale version. Their story had been messier, more painful, harder won than any children's story. But it was theirs. And in its own complicated, imperfect way, it really was a happily ever after. Because sometimes Caroline thought, the greatest love stories aren't about finding the perfect person. They're about two imperfect people who choose every single day to keep choosing each other.